Everything you say, canon will be held against you. Daniel 11 part 6, we're actually going to get up to the time of Hanukkah right now, or at least what Hanukkah celebrates. You know, oh yeah, that's Stevie.
Oh no,
hey. Steven, now everybody's going to come in.
I was working.
I know it's easier because it's light so late, you know.
Oh really? These are right up the.
Oh, awesome.
Sit right here because I'm blind. I like to put them in the refrigerator.
Well, we're rolling tape, so we'll get going.
Oh, I'm recording?
Yeah.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
Oh, everyone.
I'll try to remember to cut this part out. Yeah. But I won't make any promises.
I'm sorry. I saw that and I thought I would have never caught that.
Yeah. Anyway, so this is kind of where this is going today. But just kind of like a recap of a little bit where we're at. I'm not going to start from the beginning of chapter 11, but once we get to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, what happens is that there is a priest in Jerusalem who is a good high priest and he's devout, but Antiochus Epiphanes is bribed by this priest's brother and for the position of high priest. So you have an illegitimate priesthood by a guy named Jason, who has a legitimate high priest, his brother removed. His name's Onias, and Onias goes kind of into hiding. And then there's another one of the brothers who comes and pays an even bigger bribe to Antiochus, and he takes the high priesthood. And in the meantime, Jason had made all these reforms in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem had become completely Hellenized. They turned they were turning into another Greek city. So, you know, they had like a gymnasium built there, and a lot of the priests had abandoned their posts. They had all become like that Jerusalem had become apostate for the most part. Now, there were people who were still devout and still held on to their beliefs. There's always a remnant, right? But what we see here when you read the book of Maccabees and the Jewish like the point of view on this is that if the people in Jerusalem had stayed devoted to their Lord, this wouldn't have happened. And there was a story before this where a guy named Heliodorus, he comes to Onias saying, hey, I want to collect a bunch of tax money for the king. And Heliodorus says, no, we put that aside for the widows and orphans. And people gave their money to this temple in good faith, and I'm not doing it. I can't do it. And Heliodorus goes into the temple anyway, and he's confronted by a rider on a white horse, is knocked down. It's basically a divine apparition. And then 3 angels take cords and they flog him to almost within an inch of his life. And then he's about to die, and he actually repents, and he asks the priest to pray for him. Onias does pray for him, and he recovers, and he goes back to the king and say, hey, if you want to collect your tax money, if there's somebody you don't like, send them instead, because the same thing that happened to me is going to happen to them. And if you go in there, the same thing's going to happen to them, because their God protects them. So this happened, only one king before Antiochus Epiphanes. So when Antiochus Epiphanes did what he did, there's a comment in the book, in the second Maccabees, that says, if the people had remained true to their Lord, this wouldn't have happened. The same thing that was done to Heliodorus would have been done to Antiochus Epiphanes. But what happens is that the guy who gave the first bribe, now he's kind of like jealous, and he hears a rumor that Antiochus Epiphanes is dead, because Antiochus Epiphanes went down south to Egypt. So he tries to get the high priest back by like a battle. And when Antiochus Epiphanes hears about it, he interprets it as Jerusalem is now in a rebellion. I got to go up there and sort things out. That's when he rolls into Jerusalem and starts taking down, like stealing things out and starts persecuting the people. So he's going to do it in two waves. This is the first, I think this is a artistic rendering of the first wave when he takes out the menorah, and things haven't gotten super bad yet, but the second wave things are going to get really bad. So he goes back down south, Antiochus does, and he's going to try to take over Egypt. But what happens is that the king of the south, he's in the meantime made an alliance with Rome, and these Romans that you see on the right, they show up and say, hey, if you pick a fight with these guys down here, you're probably going to fight with us because like they're one of us now. So this ambassador draws a line around Antiochus in the sand and says, you're not leaving that circle until you make a decision. And that's where we get the expression drawing a line in the sand from, by the way. And so Antiochus is completely humiliated, and now he just wants to take it out on somebody. So he takes it out on Jerusalem. So this time things get really bad in Jerusalem, and he starts torturing people, frying them in cauldrons, cutting out their tongues, crucifying people, hanging dead babies around their mothers' necks, and a lot of gruesome stuff. And he sacrifices a pig on the altar to was it Saturn or something, or Apollo or somebody. And
Israel is occupied by Jews and Gentiles at this time.
Well, it's a Jewish city, but because of Jason, the illegitimate high priest, he wants Jerusalem to be a legitimate part of Antioch. It's because Antiochus Epiphanes, the king he's part of the Greek Empire that has its headquarters in Antioch. So Antiochus.
So the people getting persecuted are Jews.
People being persecuted are Jews, and they're also getting persecuted by their fellow Jews who want to be Hellenized and join with the Greek way of life. Yeah, so actually a lot of the Jews are inviting Antiochus in, and they're even participating in some of the killing of their own countrymen and stuff. It's really ugly. And of course, from that we have the story in the Maccabees. They're called the Maccabean martyrs. This is this was Eleazar, one guy who would refuse to eat pork, and so he was beaten to death, and then a woman and her 7 sons, and they were being killed off one by one in front of her, and they all held on because they believed in a resurrection, and that even if they were going to have their hands cut off and their tongue cut out, that still they would receive these back when they were raised in the resurrection. So the resurrection is a big part of this picture. They definitely believe in the resurrection in this. And this is actually, I think this is Eastern Orthodox, one of their icons of the Maccabean martyrs. And interestingly, again, like they've got crosses that they're holding and everything. But it just kind of like, but it ties it, like in Hebrews, it ties it to the believers, like say, and the people of faith who suffered and died for their faith in Hebrews 11 and stuff. A lot of people believe that some of those people mentioned in Hebrews 11 are actually the people that underwent suffering in this period, because it's still pretty fresh in their minds. What happens though is that there's a revolt that starts. I didn't show this picture and I didn't read this story, but there was a guy named Mattathias who starts the Maccabean revolt. And what happens is that they're told that they're going to be forced to make sacrifices to a pagan god. And Mattathias says, neither me or my sons are going to do any of this. And then some Jewish guy goes up and gives a sacrifice to Zeus or whoever, they're being forced to. And so he rushes to the altar, Mattathias does, and kills the Jewish guy and the soldier who's like forcing them to do this. And there's a rebellion that starts out of this. He dies kind of like a year later, but his son, Judas Maccabeus, starts what's called the Maccabean Revolt, and he is very successful. He beats Antiochus Epiphanes' armies, and it results in the rededication of themselves to the Lord and the rededication of the temple, and that's a thing that Jesus participated in that you can read about in John. So we'll get there. So of course, Judas Maccabeus, he fights Nicanor and his men. This is all while Antiochus Epiphanes is often in other places doing official duties, and he faces, what was it, 20,000 of Nicanor's army with 6,000 of his own, if I remember. And then he turns around and defeats another general called Timotheus. And so now, of course, Antiochus is going to hear bad news about his armies losing to this Jewish rebellion, basically. So everything we've seen in chapter 11 so far can be explained as historical events. You can trace these historical events, and it's really amazing in what kind of a detail these events were written about, hundreds of years before they even happened.
And when you mean historical, like outside of the Bible, basically.
They are, yeah, it mentions Alexander the Great, not by name, but it's like this king and then this person. So Xerxes is in there, and then every king from the Seleucid dynasty and the Ptolemies are described. Every king up to Antiochus Epiphanes is mentioned in there. And then it focuses in on what Antiochus is doing. So he's the king of the north. King of the south is the king in the Egyptian part of the Greek Empire, and they're called the Ptolemies. So it's the Seleucids in the north, which Antiochus is part of, and the Ptolemies in the south. So that's who, in Daniel, they're just called the king of the north and the king of the south. So if you read the rest of the chapter, we got up through verse 39 last time, but in 40 through 45, if you keep reading it as events that happened after verse 40, verse 39. So I don't know why I got 42 here. Should say 39. So if you read these things as coming after, they probably don't make historical sense. There's one guy who named Porphyry, and we've kind of lost his historical accounts. The only thing that we have is an indirect account by Saint Jerome, but Jerome, or I don't know if he's a saint or not, but Jerome was mentioned that Porphyry had said that these things happened just as the way that Daniel claims. The interesting thing is that Porphyry was actually skeptic of Daniel. He wanted to say that Daniel was written after all these events had happened, and that the reason that verses 40 through 45 are as the way Porphyry claims that they happened is that Porphyry himself probably manipulated the material to make it look like exactly the way that it was recorded in Daniel, because he's trying to make it look like Daniel was just copying down, writing down events after they happened. So it's a weird thing. Porphyry's not a believer, in this case. Huh? I think so, yeah. So it's kind of like a weird thing, but really everything else that we know from history is probably not something that happened, okay? In terms of like after verse 39, if you're just reading it down. But if you read it as a recap or a summary, it actually makes perfect sense. So a lot of scholars, biblical scholars, will look at the verses that we're going to cover today as, oh, now we've gotten into the time of the Antichrist, right? Like all of a sudden without saying anything.
Any segue, we're just in the future.
Yeah, we're just all of a sudden in the future now, right? Whereas if you take another look at it, you're going, wait a minute, if this is a summary, not only does it all make sense, but there's a couple details that are added in here that are recorded in history. So so that's kind of like the way that I've looked at it this week. I thought, remember weeks ago, I was saying that like once you get to a certain part, none of it makes sense in history anymore.
Yeah.
But once I took a second look at it, and especially like looking at Barnes's notes, Barnes is like, no, all of this happened, but it's just kind of a recapitulation, or like saying in summary, in the end, this is the way these things are going to happen. And I'll show you that. So you can do with it whatever you want. But in that case, there is a term here, the time of the end, which some scholars will say, well, that proves that we're talking about the end times, Jesus's return, etc. But it could also be kind of construed as, you know, like at the end of these historical events that we're talking about. In other words, the conclusion of the matter. So, you know, like Hebrew is always a little bit different to interpret. And so you could look at it that way. Either way you look at it, though, it is pointing to Christ's return. And it is pointing to the time of the end. Maybe it's a picture of things that did happen, but it's being used as a model for something that's going to happen. Okay. And you know this for sure by the time you get to chapter 12. Because when we're going to start looking at chapter 12, we're looking at the time of the resurrection and everything. And you're like, wow, somewhere in here, it kind of jumped to the future for sure. So there's always that in view, right? So verses 40 through 45, let's read them. At the time of the end, the king of the south will attack him. This is talking about, if you went back to verse 25, this is when the Ptolemy actually tries to attack Antiochus. But this is a recap of like what happened back in verse 20, events that happened way back in verse 25. And Ptolemy tried to attack Antiochus, but Antiochus overwhelmed him. We know this, right? But the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind. So Antiochus rushes on him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and many ships, because he had Antiochus had a huge navy going as well. And he came into countries. The literal term is many things, so many places. It could mean countries. He'll come into many places or countries, or into, you know, and he'll overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land, Israel, which Antiochus did, and tens of thousands shall fall. According to the Maccabees, it's about 80,000 that were killed. But these shall be delivered out of his hand: Edom, Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites. There isn't really anything mentioned so much in history about Edom, Moab, or Ammon. That's modern day Jordan and a little bit south of there. But so it's kind of remarkable that you have that strip of Israel that's totally attacked and falls to Antiochus Epiphanes, but there is no record of Edom, Moab, and Ammon, who are right next door, being overtaken by Antiochus Epiphanes. So they did escape. You know, there's no record, at least, of them having, you know, come under Antiochus's control. He'll stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He goes into Egypt, and if you remember, he does take control of Egypt. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and silver. In fact, he takes the silver and gold away from the treasuries of Egypt, and he brings them up to the north. And all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. Libya and Cush is like they're like in the northern part of Africa there, but they're attached to Egypt at this time. So there's not much mention about the Libyans and the Cushites, but we do know that they were they had an alliance with Egypt. So whatever happened to Egypt affected them, you know. So they shall follow in this train. So, but news from the east and the north, as it's going to alarm Antiochus, And what happened was that there was a revolt in Armenia by a guy named Artaxias, and then they're in Persia, like more towards the east. Actually, I think there's an exhausted treasury, and he's running out of money there. So he actually ends up going to Persia, and he tries to do something about Artaxias. And when he's there, of course, he's hearing about the success of the Maccabees, beating his guys Nicanor and Timotheus, and he gets alarmed, and then he's like, now he's really in a fury, and he's going to destroy, and he's going to come with a great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Glorious holy mountain would be the city of Jerusalem, Zion, Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. He's going to die at this point. So here's how Barnes would kind of like, summarizes this. In every way, Antiochus's wrath was kindled. He was enraged against the Jews on account of their success. He was enraged against Artaxias for revolting from him in Armenia, and he was enraged because of his treasury was exhausted. This was in Persia, and he had not the means of prosecuting the war. In this mood of mind, he crossed the Euphrates, and we record that in First Maccabees, to prosecute the war in the east. And it is said here, utterly to make many away. Everything conspired to kindle his fury, and in this state of mind he went forth on his last expedition to the east. Nothing, in fact, could be better described his state of mind of Antiochus, and the language used here in verse 44 by the charge of by the angel to Daniel. So here's from Second Maccabees. Okay, about this time, and it's going to be about the last campaign of Antiochus. About that time, as it happened, Antiochus had retreated in disorder from the region of Persia. So he's been in Persia, where he's run out of money. For he had entered the city called Persepolis and attempted to rob the temples and control the city. Therefore, the people rushed to the rescue with arms, and Antiochus and his men were defeated, with the result that Antiochus was put to flight by the inhabitants and beat a shameful retreat. While he's in Ecbatana, both Persepolis and Ecbatana, I looked them up, they're both in modern day Iran. Persia. So while he was in Ecbatana, news came to him of what had happened to Nicanor. Nicanor's, that picture with the elephants and everything, that battle. Nicanor lost big time to, his main generals, Nicanor, and the forces of Timothy. So Timothy was the other general that lost to the Maccabees. Transported with rage, he conceived the idea of turning upon the Jews the injury done by those who had put him to flight. So he's just been injured by the people in Persia, but he's going to take it out on the Jews, is what it's saying. So he ordered his charioteer to drive without stopping until he completed the journey. But the judgment of heaven rode with him, for in his arrogance he said, when I get there, I will make Jerusalem a cemetery of the Jews. But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him with an incurable and unseen blow. As soon as he ceased speaking, he was seized with a pain in his bowels, for which there was no relief, and with sharp internal tortures. So something was going on in his guts. Okay. Yeah.
When they do something wrong,
yeah.
Like Ananias and Sapphira, that's how you say their name.
Yeah. And then there was like the King Herod in chapter in the Acts. I forget chapter. He wouldn't regard the God of Israel, and so he was eaten on the inside by worms and stuff like that. Judas, his bowels fell out when he fell headlong into the field, So in sharp internal tortures, and that very justly, for he had tortured the bowels of others with many and strange afflictions. Yet he did not in any way stop his insolence, but was even more filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews and giving orders to hasten the journey. And so it came about that he fell out of his chariot as it was rushing along, and the fall was so hard as to torture every limb of his body. Here's like Noel Hall, a French artist, has this depicted. Poor Antiochus fell out of his chariot and got all injured up. Thus, he who had been thinking that he could command the waves of the sea in his superhuman arrogance and imagined that he could weigh the high mountains in a balance, was brought down to earth and carried in a litter. A litter is like a stretcher that you put between two horses, carried off the injured or whatever. He's carried off in a litter, making the power of God manifest to all. And so the godly's man's body swarmed with worms. And while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotted away. And because of his stench, the whole army felt revulsion at his decay. Because of this intolerable stench, no one was able to carry the man who a little while before had thought that he could touch the stars of heaven. So this plays off the idea that this guy thought he was some kind of a god, or that he was God or something, right? You know, and it's funny that he could command the waves of the sea. You know, what's that make you think of? This is written before the time of Christ, you know. So yeah, there is that element that they're seeing in Antiochus, somebody who had the kind of hubris where they thought of themselves as God, or some kind of a god, right? You know, or equal to God or something like that. Then it was that, broken in spirit, he began to lose much of his arrogance and come to his senses under the scourge of God, for he was tortured with pain every moment. And when he could not endure his own stench, he muttered these words: "It is right to be subject to God, and no mortal should think that he is equal to God." There you have it. He thought he was equal to God. So what I'm saying is that it matches the Antichrist theme, you know, which I don't know if the writers of the Maccabees are thinking that or not, but in any case, Antiochus makes a promise to God. How serious it is, I don't know. But then the abominable fellow made a vow to the Lord. I love that. The abominable. I like, yeah, the RSV, the Revised Standard Version. I should have liked this. I should look up what it has in the King James Version of this. Anyway, the abominable fellow who made a vow to the Lord, who would no longer have mercy on him, stating that the holy city, which he was hastening to level to the ground and to make a cemetery, he was now declaring to be free. I'm freeing Jerusalem. And the Jews, whom he had not considered worth burying, but had planned to throw out their children to the beasts for the birds to pick, he would make them, all of them, equal to the citizens of Athens. And the holy sanctuary, which he had formerly plundered, he would adorn with the finest offerings. The holy vessels he would give back, all of them, many times over. And the expense incurred for the sacrifices he would provide from his own revenues. In addition to all this, he would also become a Jew and would visit every inhabited place to proclaim the power of God. But when his sufferings did not in any way abate, for the judgment of God had justly come upon him, he gave up all hope for himself and wrote to the Jews the following letter in the form of a supplication. This was its content. To his worthy Jewish citizens, Antiochus their king, this is so politician, you know, like it makes you sick, right? To his worthy Jewish citizens, Antiochus their king and general sends hearty greetings and good wishes for their health and prosperity. If you and your children are well and your affairs are as you wish, I am glad, as my hope is in heaven. I remember with affection your esteem and goodwill. On my way back from the region of Persia, I suffered an annoying illness, and I have deemed it necessary to take thought for the general security of all. I do not despair of my condition, for I have good hope of recovering from my illness. But I observed that my father, on the occasions that he made expeditions into the upper country, appointed his successor, so that if anything unexpected happened or any unwelcome news came, the people throughout the realm would not be troubled, for they would know to whom the government was left. This is ironic because we know that Antiochus was not the rightful king. He was the brother of the last king. It should have been his brother's sons that were the king, but he stole it from them, right? So it was totally illegitimate what he did in the first place. So, you know, the person reading this is going, dude, you're not even, you know, my father, you know, did this, and so I'm going to do that too. It's like, you didn't do what your father wanted to. You stole it from his son. So, you know, like this is all, you know, this is all annoying.
Without David, the heir, for his brother,
His
he got inherited from his brother.
Well, his brother was Seleucus the fourth, right?
Yeah.
Seleucus the fourth dies, and his oldest son is in jail. Antiochus at the time is in jail, I think, but he gets out, and then he starts pretending that he's going to rule, you know, like in the stead of this. But there was a younger brother too, and so like that was totally ignored. So he kind of got in there with like kind of like the pretense, like I'm ruling on behalf of my on behalf of my brother's son, you know, and all that. But really, he was just stealing the throne because he never gave it to him. So now he's going to give it to his own son or whatever, you know. So he totally jacked it, you know, hijacked the throne, you know. That's why this describes him as like somebody who gets in with flatteries and smooth tongue and by intrigue and stuff like that. He lies his way into everything. So everything we've seen has been like really slimy. And so here he is, like you know, on his deathbed. This is also Noel Hall, you know, saying, "This is my last will and testimony, and the last thing I'd like to say to Jerusalem, and me leaving my son here to rule." Right. Moreover, I understand how the princes along the borders and the neighbors to my kingdom keep watching for opportunities and waiting to see what will happen. So I have appointed my son Antiochus to be king. This would be Antiochus V, whom I have often entrusted and commended to most of you when I hastened off to the upper provinces. And I have written to him what is written here. I therefore urge and beseech you to remember, get this, I therefore urge and beseech you to remember the public and private services rendered to you, like me killing all of you, right? And to maintain your present goodwill, each of you, towards me and my son. For I'm sure that he will follow my policy and will treat you with moderation and kindness. You know, everybody in Israel's like, oh my, you know, giant face palm or
We
whatever.
got jokes now.
Yeah, I was like, you know, going with the art theme, the old art theme. So the murderer, the blasphemer, having endured the most intense suffering, such as he had inflicted on others, came to the end of his life by the most pitiable fate among the mountains in a strange land. And Philip, the one of his courtiers, took his body home. Then, fearing the son Antiochus, he betook himself to Ptolemy Philometor in Egypt. So this guy abandons the north altogether, and he's going to go to the south because he's like, Antiochus Epiphanes is bad news, and his son's going to be bad news too. So what happens then, though, is that Jerusalem is free, and they're going to rededicate themselves, and they rededicate the temple. So now Maccabeus and his followers, the Lord leading them on, recovered the temple and the city. They tore down the altars which had been built in the public square by the foreigners, and also destroyed the sacred precincts. They purified the sanctuary and made another altar of sacrifice. Then, striking fire out of flint, they offered sacrifices. After a lapse of 2 years, they burned incense and lighted lamps and spread out the bread of the presence. This is all like where Hanukkah comes from. And when they had done this, they fell prostrate and besought the Lord that they might never again fall into such misfortunes, but that if they should ever sin, they might be disciplined by him with forbearance, not to be handed over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. So they knew that they were repenting for their sin. This is the theme in Daniel too. He knows that they're in exile because of their sin. And this is all along that theme. these things came about because of their disobedience. So the annual celebration, it happened on the same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners. The purification of the sanctuary took place. That is on the 25th day of the same month, which was in Kislev or Chislev. I don't know how to pronounce that. And they celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the matter of the Feast of Booths, remembering how not long before, during the Feast of Booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and in the caves like wild animals. This is kind of like some of the things that Hebrews is talking about, right? The heroes of faith wandering in mountains and caves and stuff. Therefore, bearing ivy wreathed wands and beautiful branches and also fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place. They decreed by public ordinance and vote that the whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year. Such was the end of Antiochus, who's called Epiphanes.
Awesome.
So yeah, it's Hanukkah. Now, not everything that you see here and that what you have in Hanukkah comes directly from those historical events. There's some traditions that have been kind of added to it. But I found a Messianic Jewish writer. Oh man, I didn't replace his name. I forget his name. He does an interesting thing where he takes violins from people who had undergone the Holocaust, and he restores them, and then orchestras play them and everything. And it's this whole thing you can look up on YouTube. I'll get his name afterwards. But he's a Messianic Jew. He believes in Christ. And so he talks a little bit about this Feast of Dedication and the way that they're looking at these events that we've covered today. He says, Hanukkah, also known as the Festival of Lights, lasted 8 days because it was celebrated, in the context of God's appointed festival of Sukkot, or the Festival of Booths or Tabernacles. The joy of the appointed time of the Lord was lived out by the Jewish people as they celebrated their rededication to the Lord. I always thought of it as the rededication of the temple, but it's their rededication to the Lord. Yeah, I never thought of it that. And I was going that I like that. It's like we're rededicating ourselves because we know that we've wandered astray. It's repentative in nature. Interestingly enough, historical narratives do not include any story of miracle oil. So you may have heard the story of the miracle oil that stays lit while they try to go get some more or whatever. This idea was developed hundreds of years later and recorded in rabbinical commentary, the Talmud. Over the centuries, the miraculous oil story was enhanced, and consequently, man-made traditions further sealed this belief with oily foods, such as latkes and donuts, some of the things that are just kind of like add-ons, like you have add-ons to, Christmas or any kind of Purim, I should say. So why should I care about Hanukkah? Great question. I know firsthand how hard it is to make this historical event celebration relevant to your faith walk. The history of the church has systematically removed the Jewish people and God's appointed feasts far away from the mostly Gentile church. It is much easier to draw divisions than to understand and be united in our faith. The phrase, "What would Jesus do?" is often said, yet most believers don't realize that Jesus celebrated Hanukkah with his Jewish disciples as recorded in the Good News account of John, and where it records, at that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. Why would John take the opportunity to record this piece of history connecting Jesus to Hanukkah? The story of Hanukkah took place 165 years before Jesus' birth. The Maccabees were under foreign rule and exposed to pagan practices, just as Jesus and his Jewish followers were under the Roman Empire. Those brave believers in Judah Maccabees' time chose to trust in God in the God of Israel, refusing to abandon their faith and remain steadfast to the promises of God's word. They would rather die, and many did die, than lose their identity and follow strange pagan practices. Similarly, Jesus's disciples and many in that first century body of believers were willing to live and to die for what they believed in. Both groups greatly impacted the kingdom of God. Both took a stand against the enemy of our souls. They chose to take God's word at face value, reminding themselves of the faithfulness of God, of Daniel in the midst of the lion's den. Back to Daniel, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when thrown into the fiery furnace, and of David and the odds against him when fighting the giant Goliath. During this Hanukkah season, so this is written around Hanukkah, during this Hanukkah season, do we have the same kind of faith as our predecessors? If we say we are followers of Christ, we should look to Jesus as our example. Jesus celebrated this miraculous victory because it was a picture of a greater deliverance yet to come. The greater Maccabee, Jesus, will return to save the remnant of Israel out of the hands of their oppressors, thus fulfilling the promise of the new covenant. So this is the way he's thinking Jesus is looking at it. It's like, I'm celebrating, because all of these feasts they all point to Jesus anyway. All the sacrifices, all of these details in the law, the more you look at them, the more they are a type of Christ. And even when you look at the events in the Old Testament, the events, you see what you would call types, right? And so even though this is a prophecy of things that happened historically, you can still look at the events in chapter 11 as something that points to the future. So Paul said the following: for if Israel's rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? We have an obligation to teach the next generation the truths of what's to come. He's talking about becoming one body and stuff. So all of chapter 11 can be attributed to past historical events leading up to the Maccabees. But beginning in chapter 12, it would seem that the messenger, the angel, is speaking of the end times and the coming of Christ. But in light of the way that Jesus himself would celebrate the Maccabean victory, it's a picture of his own coming in a sense, so well, the way that chapter 12, the next sentence in chapter 12 is going to be kind of like the conclusion of this whole thing that you've read in chapter 11. But it makes you wonder, okay, so where did it turn into something about the future? Well, the whole thing was a picture of something in the future, because the same way that the Maccabean revolt, I'm just going to end up saying what I'm about to say anyway. Here's what I mean by chapter 12, right? Because this is the next sentence after this. It says, at that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who is in charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never had been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So there, all of a sudden, that he's talking about the future, the end, right? So here's the way Barnes puts it. I love the way Barnes puts it here. He says, if the angel intended primarily to refer to the events that would occur in the time of Antiochus, to the rousing of many that would defend their country, as if called from the dust of the earth, or being summoned by Judas Maccabeus from caves and fastness, and to the honor to them which many of them might be raised, and the shame and contempt which would await others. So in other words, he's saying the language can be looked at a little bit like rising from the dust of the earth. It's like these people who are good as dead coming out of nowhere and then and being risen up and delivered, right? The speaker at the same time glanced onward to higher doctrines, and that it was the intention of the angels to bring into view this far distant events, of which these occurrences might be regarded as an emblem. So he's saying these things that actually happened are an emblem for what's to come, and that he meant to avert to what would literally occur in the time of the Maccabees as a beautiful and striking illustration of a more momentous and glorious scenes when the earth should give up its dead and when the final judgment should occur. So it's kind of like, remember I was saying that it's already but not yet, kind of I don't even know if that's a good description for it anymore. But it's but you can go through I don't think it's like a good habit to like look at these things and then try to figure out, well, is there going to be another king that's going to be in like that in Asia Minor who attacks Egypt and Jordan and Moab and Ammon are right there, and this is all going on in Jerusalem, and news from the north and from the east are going to detract him. So that's all kind of like a future thing that we're trying to guess what's going to happen in the last days. I don't think that like that kind of like trying to like speculate that way with those verses isn't really may not be helpful.
The only reason to want to do that is because Daniel never says Antiochus. He just says the king from the north, so that kind of leaves it open.
It could be because, but like you remember, like he's writing it, from the and from
he's in Babylon.
He's in Babylon hundreds of years before any of this happens, right? So what drives me up the wall sometimes is that, like, like if I was trying to look at a lot of this stuff, like, well, it sounds like the Antichrist is going to come from the Middle East. And then I read other things because it sounds like it's coming from the Roman Empire. It sounds like this, and it's like, no, these are all pictures of something else. But we're probably looking at something much more general than saying, that, they're going to be, they're going to have the same character as these stories.
It's like seasonal, like
it's
over and over again.
Right. So on these scenes, and I think we'll end here, on these scenes, perhaps the mind of the angel ultimately rested, and a prominent part of the design of the entire vision may have been to bring them into view and to direct the thoughts of the pious onward, far beyond the troubles and the triumphs in the days of the Maccabees, to the time when the dead should arise and when the retributions of eternity should occur. So it's a mouthful. Sorry that I did so much reading today. I usually don't, it's like
I didn't hear him.
Hannah. Yeah, you were in here for part of it. But yeah, it's just because I found some things that I think that like they could write them better than I could. And it's nice to kind of like read just from the Maccabees and the way that they saw it. So there is, I think, a sense in which, and I'll talk about this more next week, because what I'm going to do is more kind of like summarize the big themes that we've seen in Daniel, because we've kind of like, we've been in Daniel for a long time. But there is, I was talking today with somebody who was and we were talking about like the 70 weeks of Daniel, and he was asking me about like what I thought about like the 7-year tribulation and things, and I was like, there's nothing in Daniel that says 7-year tribulation.
No, it says 7 weeks.
Well, even then, there's a tribulation. Yeah, there's tribulation here in Antiochus Epiphanes' time, but even in Daniel 9, it doesn't say there's a it says there's going to be an end of sacrifice in the middle of the 7th week, but it's not like there's nothing there that tells you there's a 7-year tribulation. And as a matter of fact, there is a sense in which the Jews have thought themselves in tribulation ever since they lost Jerusalem the first time, going into exile. So you know that saying, like that part where Jesus' disciples ask him, so how often should I forgive my brother? 70 times? And he's like, 70 times 7, right? Well, the same kind of like language appears in Daniel 9. Daniel prays over the 70 years. He knows from the book of Isaiah that exile is supposed to be 70 years, right? So he fasts and he prays and he makes supplications on behalf of Israel. And then the angel appears to him and he says, 70 times 7 weeks of years are designated to, or well, I forget the word, for your people. It's kind of like you're thinking of these 70 years, like your lifetime. It's like this exile may be over in that sense, but exile's not over. And there's going to be there's desolations that are decreed. This is one desolation, and you were there for one of these desolations, but there's other desolations that are going to happen in the future. So he's given him hundreds of years of desolation. And so when you get to the Great Tribulation mentioned in the book of Revelation, these are the ones who come out of the Great Tribulation. I heard one scholar say, this is the same tribulation that the Jews had seen themselves in for centuries. And now John is adding what we think of as a church to that. It's not like it's not a thing where you go like, well, it's just this period of time. It's the Great Tribulation is right now in Iran. The Great Tribulation is right now, was in the 1st century. The Great Tribulation has been in many parts of the world quite often, and actually if we go back here, I kind of put this to the side a little bit, but if you look at this in Thessalonians here, right, it says, this is Paul writing, and he says, therefore we ourselves boast about you in the churches of God for your steadfast faith and in all your persecutions and in the afflictions that you are enduring. So he's talking to first century believers, right? This is evidence of the righteous judgment of God, that you may be considered worthy of the kingdom of God, for which you are also suffering. Since indeed God considers it just to pay with afflictions those who afflict you, and to grant relief to you who are afflicted as well as to us, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven in his mighty angels. So they will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might, when he comes on the day to be glorified in the saints. So when is he talking about? He's telling first century Christians that they are going to be vindicated, and that their enemies are going to come to judgment when Jesus comes back. So does he think this is going to happen in their lifetimes?
No.
I mean, it could be after they died and they come back to life too, right?
Well, yeah. So here's the thing: is that like some people will look at this and go, "Well, the early church thought that Jesus was going to come back in their lifetimes really soon." I think that's true, but then but I'm not going to dismiss this as something like, "Well, Paul was just wrong." It's like they all died, and whatever, and the day of the Lord never came in their lifetime. So what is he talking about? So he has to be talking about the time of the resurrection of the dead. And some are going to be resurrected to eternal glory, and some are going to be resurrected to eternal destruction. But that's when all this is going to take place. So he's talking to them the same way that the Maccabees were seeing, in a way, what was going to happen to them. They were like, when they, when we were reading about the Maccabean martyrs, they were saying, "You're going to kill me now. Go ahead and chop off my hands and burn me and whatever, because I will be resurrected on that day, but God's going to take vengeance on you." It's the same thing. So when you get to the end of chapter 11 in Hebrews, it was like all these died in the faith, but it's so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. It's like we, along with the Maccabees, along with the Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, who were rescued out, and along with everybody else who suffered for their faith, and throughout the ages, we're going to be rewarded and vindicated on the same day. It's the same occurrence for all of them. So that's why when you look at like Daniel 11, and that's why you can look at Daniel 9 and say, well, that brings you to the Roman era and things that happened there to the believers. And then you can read to the Daniel 11, which doesn't bring you to the Roman era. It brings you to the Greek era and the persecution of God's people. And it's all it all kind of ends up in the same place where how does Paul put it? Grant relief to you. He's going to give you relief when he comes back. So the first, yeah, he's like he's talking about it as present tense, right? So since God indeed considers it just to repay with affliction those who afflict you, and to grant grant relief to you who are afflicted as well as to us, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven with his mighty angels. So there's always that sort of jump forward. Yeah. It's like, this is applying to, we're talking about this now in the first century, but we're talking about something that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
That's why I keep on saying already, but not yet. He's talking to them like as if it's about to happen to them.
Where you have that expectation.
They have that expectation it's about to happen. In Daniel, you would almost read that and say, well, you would expect, the resurrection to happen right when Antiochus Epiphanes shows up and does his thing, right? Because if you're going from 11 and chapter 11, there's no chapter breaks, in the original Hebrew or anything. So and then you go, then, like at that time, Michael will arise and all this, and they're going to rise up from the dust. So it puts them, the Maccabees, right at that place of like the resurrection. It's like fast forward. It's like all of a sudden they've jumped to the resurrection, but Paul does the same thing.
It's interesting to me, like the affliction and afflict, if that was from the Septuagint, but then if you read, or like, I don't know, I wonder if in the original Hebrew, it'd be interesting if the like afflict had an ED at the end. Like,
well, this is Greek because it's New Testament. So.
Okay, like, I like the tense of the word afflict. If it said like those who afflicted you, then it can make it sound past tense.
Yeah, to grant relief.
It says afflict, so it makes it sound like present tense.
Yeah. Since indeed God considers it just to repay with affliction those who afflict you. You mean if that's
because afflict is present tense.
Yeah.
So like
well, so he's going to so those who afflict you. So he's identifying the people who are afflicting you now, they're the ones who are going to be afflicted when Jesus comes back.
Yeah. The
day of the Lord is a wonderful thing. And for those who await him, but he's a thief in the night for those who aren't. And it's not a fun time. Just like in what am I thinking? In Malachi, he's telling the Jews they're offering sacrifices, but he's like, hey, you got bloody hands, you've stolen my tithes, you've done all this, and he's like, why do you think that the day of the Lord is going to be good for you? It's going to be burning like a fire. You're going to be one of these people who's like, the day of the Lord has come. Hide us, O caves and rocks, and fall us on us on the mountains or whatever. it's not gonna be fun for you because it's a day of judgment. Yeah, so that's so for the righteous, they look forward to the day of the Lord. But for those who are not living righteously or who are, on the other side of the equation, it's not a fun time.
It's interesting to step back, like today I was thinking about yeah. You just thought to stop the recording?
No, I just
Oh, Steve's gonna talk.
I'm just gonna put you on camera. That's it. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, no, I was thinking about that's been kind of running through my spirit since I've heard you say it. For the first time I've ever heard it, like
What?
a few months ago, about already,
Already, but not yet.
but not yet, but today it struck me as I was meditating that that's really how so many promises in God's word are, because
Right.
healing, it's already, but not yet.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like he's already done it, it's finished,
Right.
but we are still awaiting or praying or working out our salvation, whatever it is, to see it manifested,
Right.
to see, our body, we groan for righteousness.
Yeah.
We groan for it.
Grown.
And
Remember, Aaron, the verse that like you sent me today about like
Oh.
the all of creation groans as in birth pains,
Yeah.
waiting for the sons of God to be revealed.
I've just I've been feeling that in me, just a yearning, like for purity, and it's like, it's funny because Aldi and I mentor him, and we talk like once every Wednesday night. By the way, Walt lost his uncle today. He passed away, so pray for him and his family.
Thank you.
We'll pray for you before you leave. But anyway, so it was I've just been seeing like that yearning, like be manifested. You know what I mean? Like feeling myself even changed after all these years of walking with God.
Right.
And it's exciting, and it's by faith, right?
Yeah.
I think there's a big desire, like growing for purity, like amongst a lot of people I talked to lately. It's kind of cool.
And it's so much better. You know what I mean? Just like it's unbelievable. What's that?
Hey,
I,
Mark,
I kind of pictured as kind of like you have like this dry desert, right? And like you have the already, which is like a sprinkling of rain comes, and you see a couple flowers appear. But the latter, but like that there's like no, it's like, but the real rain's coming later.
Mm.
It's like Jesus comes and
Or like
like he heals
Elisha,
and
there's
he
a little
raises
cloud.
he raises people from the dead and all that, but they all die.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, this is a taste of it. This healing is a taste of it. But who are we in the meantime? It's like we're his body, who's like we're the ones, who are supposed to be pure and to bring this living water to a dry world.
Mhm.
And to it's kind of like it's the first fruits. It's that hint, that smell of something that like is coming. And I think that's kind of like that. That's where it's like, yeah, I'm saved. In principle, I know I'm saved. I'm still having to work out my salvation, and in the end, I will be saved. It is already, but it's also not yet.
Mhm.
The new creation is here. It's in us, but we still have to die, and all of creation still groaning for the sons of God to be revealed, just the way Christ was revealed in Revelation. It's like this is who his body is now. And who he has reigning with him, the inheritors of God's kingdom.
Have you seen?
The Commonwealth of Israel.
Have you heard the movie His Only Son?
You saw it already?
Yeah.
That's like fresh, dude.
What is it?
His Only Son.
His Only Son.
It's that's off my tree. Yeah.
Oh,
They're so good.
Is it Abraham or Isaac?
Abraham, the story of Abraham.
Oh, geez, yeah.
But it was like so intense. The scene with him and his wife, because she was like, not, you know,
About, the scene about Hagar?
yeah, but you know, she was just like, not even, he had to have such faith,
Mm.
you know.
Yeah, she's like, how can you believe in this God?
Right,
Let
at
us
that-
out of the desert.
And I just thought, wow, wouldn't it, you know, as long as, what it would encourage to us, because as long as we have breath, there's hope, you know. And then I was funny because where did I go? Oh, I went down the.
Rabbit hole?
I gotta confess. No, I went down. Yeah, I've been there. I went down to Dairy Queen the other night,
Oh,
and down the street. Did you see the fire burn next there? Next to Dairy Queen, a bunch of the businesses burned. My buddy's business burned.
the ones like where that's active or the ones that are empty?
No, the
Like the restaurant right there, Carostina?
no. Next to Dairy Queen is a preschool. Then there's a cleaners, and then there's a UPS store, and then a bagel place. But anyway, when I was coming back, or when I came out, I just bumped the button on the steering wheel that changed the channel, and it went to Tony Evans. I'm like, huh, Tony Evans, it's on the radio, and I was listening to him. He was talking about Samson, and long story short, he went to the end of his life, and he said he made the point that in the last minutes of his life, he did more than he did for 19 years of serving God.
Oh, that's interesting.
And he said, that's what he said. He said, as long as you have, you know, we
Your
get,
ends will be.
yeah,
better than
we get to where we're like, it's too late. You know what I mean? I haven't done it, but I mean, it's not too late for God to use us to do whatever he wanted to do, what his purposes were for us.
And even use Samson's folly, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Use, you know, like Samson screwed up, and that's why
He
where
screwed up
He's screwed up
literally.
royally. Yeah,
You know,
but God uses that situation to pull off the biggest thing he ever pulled through Samson.
Yeah.
Samson. Yeah.
you know what someone said about the Isaac and that movie, like we were talking about it, like it's interesting is if I was like, why did God wait so long to give them the child where they resulted to going to Hagar, you know? Hagar. So, but I was like thinking too, maybe if they would have just went with Hagar and then he didn't have a son with Isaac, and then God asked him to offer that son Ishmael as a sacrifice,
You would have let him follow through with it?
he wouldn't have done it, I don't think. Because he wouldn't have had the faith in God. Like, but because God, like, well, God,
Oh, I see what you're
I
saying.
had faith
Yeah.
in you, but we had to make it happen our own way.
Right.
But because they did that, and then God still gave him the promised seed through Sarah, that's probably what gave him the faith to be able to sacrifice, be willing to sacrifice Isaac. Like if he didn't go through that situation with Hagar, like, because I go beat myself up sometimes over stuff in my past, like, man, I did this and I did this, and why did I do that? And I wasted all these years. But then I also think, geez, I might not be with God where I am now, or have the faith I was now if I didn't do some of that stupidness. Kind of like Abraham's faith might have not have been bolstered to where it was. And with his trust in God, if he didn't go to Hagar first and then to Sarah, you know, but
He takes the bad and makes it good.
yeah.
Somehow, you know.
I thought the coolest thing in that movie was the two servants. Because it talks about two servants that went with him to the land of Moriah and all that. And in this movie, they present them as almost, to me, I saw it as the parallel of the two thieves on the cross. One that has a great attitude and one that has a horrible attitude. And that was almost the most touching thing
Wow,
to me
yeah.
about the movie. Is that I was like, oh my gosh, that's the summation of the whole world. You're either like a bitter victim that's mad at everybody, or you have a soft heart that's that God can work with, basically.
That's actually part of the the him bringing sacrifice of the son is a type of Christ's, you know, walk
That's
to
what
the
we were talking about
cross.
at the Passover dinner last night.
Right. But that's part that I never really caught, was like the two servants,
Yeah.
and then that they're portrayed as like the thieves on the cross. One is
That was
right
so
up.
cool. They did that in the movie. Like they portrayed him. One was bitter and like, oh, why are we serving him? And da 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 da. And then the other guy is like, man, look at your attitude. You think you're great. It was cool.
Right.
That was like one of the.
Did you go to Mount Moriah?
Well, I'm kind of confused.
Well, okay, Mount Moriah is,
Basically a hill
it's
of
just,
Jerusalem,
it's
right?
just it's just where the temple would have been. It would be like where the Aqsa is where
Yeah, then I
Jesus
was-
is crucified,
Well,
like,
then,
right?
yes,
It's
I
all
did-
like one big hilltop,
I
right?
did 30,000 steps 2 days in a row in Jerusalem. So yes, I walked all up and down.
Yeah. So he brings them to the place where the offerings are going to be brought in the temple, right? And where Jesus ultimately is going to be sacrificed. It's all like the same spot.
And it's
You know,
interesting,
yeah.
Judas actually was killed on Passover around 3 p.m. is when he died, when they would have been sacrificing the Passover lambs at the same time.
Right.
And I don't know, it's really interesting.
And in his mind, like in Abraham's mind, his son was dead for 3 days
yeah,
as
and
they're
he
making
was
that
resurrected back to life.
he carries the wood up
Yeah,
the son carries the wood up the
they did
up
it
the
beautiful.
hill.
You're gonna love that movie. They did a
Okay,
beautiful
cool.
job.
They caught that whole
Oh yeah,
all the parallels,
yeah,
right?
yes.
Ignore the wigs and the
Nice.
and the ages of the actor.
Why didn't you tell me that?
What's
I don't think about the wigs. I
You know,
threw
one
it.
thing,
Dude, the wigs are looking.
You out of here, John?
yeah,
What,
can I
I'm
say
sorry.
something?
What was?
Yeah.
You know,
Please go
one
ahead.
thing that when Abraham took his son up on the hill, he didn't doubt God because his son asked, well, where's the sacrifice?
Mhm.
And Abraham had enough intuition to trust God that he would provide the sacrifice and not his son.
Right. He
And-
tells him, God will provide himself a sacrifice.
You're right. And to the fact is that he had enough wisdom to know that God was going to provide it. And he didn't doubt, he didn't mistrust God and to do it.
Right.
In other words, he knew God was going to do it, and he had the faith to carry it through his part.
Yeah, like as Paul said, he knew that, like, even if he died, that that God was able to raise him up from the dead,
Yeah.
but like, more importantly, I think, is that he knew that God was going to provide the sacrifice. Ultimately, it's a prophetic thing, that
Yeah.
he saw, like in that whole situation, that God is going to ultimately provide the sacrifice.
Mhm.
So both times, that's the same.
But that's
Yeah.
fantastic. Knowing
Yeah.
that God is going to guide us in things happening. And it's funny that it's a time where God works out things in a way that you don't even expect it. And he's blessed each one of us in different ways on that situation that we face. And he brings forth the answer if we just trust him and keep on serving him.
Yeah.
It makes a big difference. But I do have a good story on that. Dealing with my Derek, my son, that back a ways he put down a down payment on a particular car or a truck actually, and it was not coming, so he sort of backed out of it. And the people at the car dealership that he was dealing with, Derek asked for his deposit back, and he got it back. And what happened is he was driving his old beat up car, and it had a problem, and it was going to cost him money on getting it fixed. But he got a telephone call from the dealership that he was put this reserve on a car back about a year or so ago. And they said, according to the law, we have to ask you, do you still want this vehicle? And he said, yeah. And now did he know that his truck broke down? It was gonna cost him a lot of money. But God had another plan for him to supply this brand new truck to him. And they had over 30 people that were in line to buy the truck if he didn't want it. You tell me God doesn't provide even when we don't realize it? And he is faithful every time.
Amen.
And to me, it is a testament of God's faithfulness, even sometimes when we don't deserve it. But God is faithful to supply the needs that we have.
That's what I was thinking.
I don't think I've ever.
I don't remember ever deserving it.
when we don't deserve it.
But it was just, God's plan everything in order.
Mhm.
And it would save him. He has a brand new truck
Mhm.
that he wasn't expecting. He was expecting to pay, a bunch of money to get his old truck fixed.
Mhm.
But God supplied him with a new truck.
Yep.
And he didn't, and he was flabbergasted no less when he got the call from the dealer.
Mhm.
They said, we know you paid you about that, but according to law, we have to ask you, do you want this vehicle? Tell me God doesn't supply.
Yeah.
God is faithful in what he does to each one of us.
Yeah. He is.
You're not recording still, right?
I am still recording.
Oh,
I can stop the.
I wanted to. I'm just trying to get
Should I end recording?
No, I'm not gonna say
Okay.
nothing crazy. I wanted to ask about Daniel.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I want to make sure I'm wrapping my brain around this right, like, cause we were reading stuff from Josephus and the Maccabees and different sources.
Yeah.
And everything that you were presenting tonight, like, I almost wish I could see it, like, I'm too visual, I guess. Like, what you're doing is, like, everything you read from other sources tonight, was basically. You're tying in with other records, what Daniel was talking about, right?
Right.
Is that the way to see it? So when he said the
Yeah.
king from the north did this, and then the king from the da da da, so you're saying, oh, that's where in the Maccabees it said Antiochus
Yeah.
came down. That's kind of like how you did everything tonight, right?
Yeah. That's
Okay.
kind of how I did all of
The last couple.
chapter 11. So like chapter 11 is like, I mean, because it goes through like hundreds of years of history, and it traces down the kings to Antiochus Epiphanes. There are some things that, like you just know from history, stuff about, like Xerxes or Alexander the Great, and all that. When you get closer to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, though, that was a time that really, really impacted the people in Jerusalem, the Jews, And so you have Josephus writing about it because he's Jewish. You have what's recorded in the books of the Maccabees or whatever, and you have and one of the reasons I really wanted to look at the Maccabees more closely is because I wanted to see how they interpret these events, and how they process them. So obviously,
They had read the writings of Daniel too.
yeah. Oh, they're very familiar with Daniel. Yeah, Daniel was like a staple for
So
them.
do you think the Maccabees got it?
The Maccabees, what they're looking, yeah, when they for the people that were living at the time when Antiochus Epiphanes were there, for people who knew their scriptures or knew Daniel, they're like, this is all happening now, and we could have traced this over the last hundreds of years, what was going to happen today.
Yeah.
So for them it was it had to been kind of like one thing after another. When Jesus shows up with, like in Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, we just celebrated Palm Sunday.
Yeah.
They could have looked at Daniel and said, this many years from the decree from the decree to go to rebuild the Jerusalem until the presentation of the anointed one, the Messiah King, using the Jewish calendars and taking out the leap years and all that kind of stuff and making those adjustments. you come to a particular day, apparently, when Jesus presents himself in Jerusalem and then he cries over Jerusalem and says, you know, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you didn't even know the time of your visitation, you know, and so for this reason, your city's going to be left desolate and not one stone's going to be left on another. He is pronouncing you know, knowing Daniel, knowing what you see in the book of Maccabees, it all starts to really make sense when Jesus appears on the scene. And he starts talking about when you see the abomination that causes desolation, get out of Jerusalem. He tells, and the people, when the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem, the Christians got out of there. They were like, this is no good. And this city is going to come under condemnation, and we're going to see an abomination that causes desolation. The way that Luke puts it was when you see the city surrounded by armies. They used that verse, the Christians did. They used that verse to say, we need to get out of Jerusalem. So that they were already selling their properties and everything, you know, so, yeah. Plus they were being driven out of Jerusalem.
I've got to go. We'll see you guys
Okay,
later.
see you, John. I think I'll end this.